Well, in this video, let's talk about Spring Boot auto configuration. So whenever we create any Spring Boot application, Spring Boot automatically spins up a Tomcat server for us, right? Not just Tomcat, JSON automatically starts working for us. And when we add few database properties in the application.properties file, then suddenly our app is ready to connect to database, right? So this kind of feels like a magic, but under the hood it's a clean system. That's what we're going to look at in this video. Now we will try to open that magic box and try to see exactly what Spring Boot is doing behind the scene. So for this magic, Spring Boot calls it auto configuration. Okay, so the idea is pretty simple. Spring Boot looks at what is in your class path, like Tomcat, Spring MVC, or Jackson, and based on the class path or the configurations or the environment that our application is running on, it is going to automatically create and register beans in the application context. Okay, so how does it do that? So there is a lot of conditions, and based on those conditions, if it matches those conditions, it's going to register beans in the application context, and if it does not match with the conditions set in the auto configuration classes, it's not going to register beans in the application context. Okay, so once these beans are registered in the application context, Spring Boot is going to make these beans, of course, once they are in the application context, they are going to be eligible for dependency injection. So we don't need to write any boilerplate configuration to get to start working with this beans, right? So in a nutshell, we can say that Spring Boot auto configuration is conditionally creating and registering beans based on our class path or configuration or the environment that our application is running on, right? And how does it do it again? So this is based on certain conditions. So Spring Boot provides us with a lot of conditional annotations. That's what we're going to look at later on. And just for context, a little bit on the conditional annotations. So some of the conditional annotations that are available are conditional on class, conditional on missing bean, conditional on property, conditional on web application, and conditional on Boolean property. So these are some of the conditional annotations that we can use to conditionally check and set our application to register beans in the application context. Okay, so there is much more. There's a really big list of conditional annotations that we can start to work with, right? So but before that, we need to ask, right, how does Spring get this power to automatically configure stuff for us, right? So the power it gets from this annotation called enable auto configuration, and explicitly we don't configure these annotations usually, but this comes as one of the constituents of popular Spring Boot application annotation, right? So Spring Boot application annotation is comprised of Spring Boot configuration and then component scan and enable auto configuration. So this enable auto configuration is what powers auto configuration in Spring Boot. Okay, so in order to visualize a few things, we're going to create a simple Spring Boot application, and then we're going to open that up in our IDE. Okay, so let's create this simple application. So we're going to choose Java Maven, and then we're going to choose Spring 4.0.1 as a Spring Boot version. Then just fill in the details with group artifact ID and the package name. Then what we're going to do is we're going to choose jar as packaging type and Java 25 as the Java version. Okay, now once we generate this project and open it up in our IDE, so this is what it looks like. Now let me clear this for a second here, and just to make sure everything works just fine, let's rerun this application. Stop. Okay, see, So this application runs just fine, and we don't have anything other than this entry point class, and we do not have any other configurations in the application.properties. So this is a very simple Spring Boot application, and as soon as we run this application, so we're going to get this Tomcat initialized, right? And this Tomcat is already started on this port for us, right? So if you go to pom.xml here and see, so the dependencies that we have here is just Spring Boot starter web MVC and web MVC test, right? So as we set this dependency in pom.xml, Spring Boot is going to understand that we are building some web application and we need some web server. So that's how it's going to start Tomcat server for us. Okay, so let's close this down and try to see what is going on internally here. But before that, let's try to see this annotation in the entry point class called Spring Boot application, right? So if you hover over this annotation, you'll see, so this annotation is a combination of Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan, right? So Spring Boot configuration is basically going to look at the configuration classes, right? The classes that are annotated with @configuration. And component scan is going to look for classes that are annotated with @component, right? So it's going to load those components. But right now we don't have any component annotated classes and configuration annotated classes, right? So we can focus our discussion with this annotation only, right? Enable auto configuration. So since we do not have any other components or configuration classes, we can actually go ahead and comment this out and replace this with @enable auto configuration annotation, right? So as discussed before, this is what powers auto configuration in Spring Boot applications. So let's go ahead and restart this and see if it is going to work. And it works just fine, right? So how does this auto configuration know what to configure and how to configure? So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. Okay, so if you go to this external libraries over here, right? So you can go to this auto configure. So this is the library we have here, and inside this you will find this jar called auto configure jar, right? So now let me take you to Spring docs here. So here is a doc about creating your own auto configuration, right? So it talks about a lot of other things, but one important thing I like to show is auto configuration candidates. Okay, so Spring is going to, when you start your application, Spring is going to look at what are the auto configuration candidates that are available, and then it's going to see if the condition specified matches or does not match, right? So if it matches, it's going to configure that for us automatically, create and register that bean for us, right? If it does not match, then it is not going to register beans for us. So that's what's happening. But where do we find these auto configuration candidates, right? So for that, we can check this auto configuration.imports file under meta inf, right? So if we go here to back to our code here, and under this one, Spring Boot auto configure jar, inside this one, inside Spring, we can see this file, right? So here we have this 12 auto configuration candidates, right? So these are the name of auto configuration candidates. So for example, AOP auto configuration, right? But we don't see anything related to Tomcat yet, right? So even though our application is already started, we cannot find Tomcat in this file. So starting with Spring Boot 4, so a lot of this candidate auto configuration candidates are moved to their respective modules, right? So they have modularized Spring Boot jars starting version 4, right? So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at something different. Okay, let's go here and look for something called Tomcat, right? So there is a bunch of these Tomcat things over here, but we're just going to look at Tomcat, Spring Boot, Tomcat, this one, right? So let's expand this a little bit and go to meta-inf and see these things under Spring, right? So here we can see this TomcatServletWebServerAutoConfiguration, right? So this is one of the candidates, right? Now we know this candidate, so there can be a lot of these other candidates in other jar files as well. So when we start our Spring Boot app, now Spring is going to look at the list of candidates and it's going to check the condition, and based on the condition, if they match, it's going to register bean for us, or let's say but how does it actually match, right? So that's what we're going to look at in this one. Now, so before we do that, we can also do something in our application.properties file. Let's go to application.properties file and let's start this logging label for auto configure model to debug. Okay, now once we do this, it is going to give us something. Let's restart this and see the changes in the console. Okay, so we see a lot of these things printed in the console. Let's go to the top, and so here if we see, Spring Boot now gave us this condition evaluation report, right? This condition evaluation report is basically listing down all the positive matches out of all the auto configuration candidates, right? So these are all these auto configuration candidates that we looked into different jars that are available in the project directory, right? So this, out of this, all these candidates, so what are the positive matches and what are the negative matches? Okay, so if you scroll down a little bit, we see these negative matches as well, right? So this is just the logs of positive and negative matches, but to understand a little bit more of what is happening within this configuration candidate classes, we can take a look at Tomcat. Let's look for Tomcat Servlet web server auto configuration, right? So let's just copy this and let's try to see the code inside it. Okay, so this is the conditional condition, right? So this is what we talked about earlier. Now let's talk about this first conditional on class annotation. Okay, so what this is basically saying is, if you see any of these classes listed over here in the class path, go ahead and register Tomcat web server bean for me, or in other words, make a Tomcat web server ready to use, right? So here you see conditional on web application, right? So if the type of if you find that the type of web application is servlet, just go ahead and spin up a Tomcat web server for us. So that's what it's doing here. Okay, now we can also look for, so this is a positive match, right? So you find these under matches, right? Tomcat, where is that? Tomcat Servlet web server auto configuration. This is not the one, right? So we were looking at the, just a second here, let's go up and little up, auto configuration, let's go up here, and yes, so this one right here, so Tomcat Servlet web server auto configuration, right? So this is the one. Now if you see here, this matches two conditions here, right? So conditional on class, this is the one we were looking at, and conditional on web application, right? So this is on web application condition. So this found out that the type is servlet, and then it spin up Tomcat server for us. Okay, so let's see for the reactive one. Okay, so reactive web server auto configuration. Okay, now let's try to copy this and see the code inside it. So if you see here, Now for this one, it did not match the conditional on web application, right? So for this one, it should match the type of application to be reactive, but in our case it's not reactive, it's a servlet app. So this is not going to configure Tomcat reactive web server for us. Okay, instead it's going to configure Tomcat Servlet web server for us. So that's how it is working internally. Okay, so this was about the Tomcat configuration or Tomcat auto configuration. Now in the next part we will do the same thing for database auto configuration, right? And then we'll see how only a few properties written in application.properties file turn into a real data source bean. That's what we're going to explore in the next part.